Fresh Air production.
Hi and welcome to Fresh Ears. I'm Neil Cowling, the founder of Fresh Air Production. We make podcasts for brands large and small, and in this series we speak to our producers and clients to dissect the work we've done in the hope that it's useful to other people who are looking to create a podcast series for their brand. And clients don't come much bigger than National Grid, the organisation responsible for distributing gas and electricity across the UK and parts of North America. Their podcast series is called The Clean Energy Revolution, and Series 1 is hosted by Helen Skelton. We explore the huge schemes and innovations that will help us all move towards clean and renewable energy systems with the aim of achieving net zero by 2050.
If you're thinking about getting a car, the next thing you should do is get an EV. And that's a huge chunk of your own carbon emissions gone. In about 5 or 10 years' time, people will start talking a lot more about low carbon heating and zero carbon heating. And when they do that, you should choose a low carbon heating system. And if you did those things, then we will get to zero carbon, we will fight climate change.
So why would National Grid create a podcast? Joining me to talk this through is Mark Goss, the Group Brand Manager of National Grid, and our very own Katharine Kerr, Senior Producer here at Fresh Air, who's been running the podcast production. Hi, both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
So, Mark, let's go from the top. National Grid is an organisation that I think we all know of, and we probably know broadly what National Grid does, if not exactly what National Grid does. So why would an organisation like National Grid decide to make a podcast? What were you trying to achieve with it?
Well, I think there's probably a number of reasons, but a lot of it comes down to wanting to engage a wider audience, both the general public and our more specific stakeholder groups, which are, industry, regulatory, people that are interested in energy and climate change and the impacts of climate change.
I say we all probably think we know roughly what National Grid does, but is there a communications challenge that most people actually in real life don't know what National Grid do or don't know the full extent of what you do?
Well, I think most people know that National Grid is something to do with electricity and, a number of people something to do with gas that were involved somewhere, both in the UK and the northeast US where we operate. But what they don't necessarily know is that we are a company that has a very specific role transmitting the energy from where it's generated to the distribution companies that then send it into homes and businesses. But also, I guess National Grid has got quite a big role in actually making a clean energy future happen, because we need to take all the clean energy and take that to where it's going to be used in future as well. Why
did you think that a podcast would be a useful way of communicating what you do?
Well, we've got an objective to get to a wider set of audiences, both the general public and people that are particularly interested in the role that energy plays in helping to tackle climate change, creating clean energy. So we were quite keen to try different channels to reach the audience, and it's a really good chance to have a slightly more sort of relaxed conversation with quite a wide range of people with different views and interests about some of the key subjects around climate change and energy's role in tackling climate change that we want to get to a wider audience.
And Katharine, you've been working with Fresh Air for a long time now. We've been working together for a very long time. Why did this appeal to you?
Well, I suppose in addition to sort of culture and history, I do a lot of projects and programmes around sustainability and the environment and the natural world. And that's a strong interest of mine personally. However, when you start to look at sort of science and technology, there was a natural coming together of all of those things under the National Grid banner as we started to talk about it. So you had stories of technical innovation and really great engineering. You had human stories and stories about job opportunities. You had stories about working with natural resources and natural environments. And the energy story actually connects all of those things. So it was actually a really great match in terms of my personal interests and in terms of bringing together some really interesting subject strands that have some really diverse audiences, as Mark suggested there.
It's a big old topic, isn't it? National Grid's obviously an enormous organisation. Sustainability, full stop, is a massive topic. How much did you have to learn about the organisation before you could start making a podcast for them?
Oh, it took me a long time to get my head around it because, yeah, as you say, there's an enormous remit there. The responsibility and actual kind of the role National Grid plays is very much as an enabler of many of these different things coming together. I mean, the course of the series was gradually to layer up information to a listener who may have an interest in science, tech, environment, energy, politics, all of those things, but not have a specific knowledge of how energy plays a role in that story, in that mix. And so we started with the basics, really. National Grid were amazingly generous with their time. They're a big organisation with some very busy and very important staff, but actually the top dogs made time to share information and make sure that I understood it from a very, pedestrian starting point as well. Very much taking the viewpoint that we want to not leave a stone unturned in terms of how we explain these ideas. And we started with a very clear brief of leading up to COP26. We wanted to focus on these 4 main goals that National Grid was going to talk about there as well, that were going to be important on the national stage and the international stage and in conversations at COP. Those were transport and the role of energy in transport and providing energy to future transport. They were hydrogen as a concept that we wanted to explore, which I knew absolutely nothing about, and offshore energy and the development of these hubs and clusters, and homes and making homes green and heating in particular. In my head, I was coming at it from a very much consumer perspective. National Grid are the people that kind of make all that stuff happen for us so we can make a cup of tea in the ad break of something or at the end of EastEnders or whatever. It was a huge challenge to get the head round all the different concepts and the responsibilities of this international organisation, because obviously Grid operates in the northeast United States as well. But it was amazing fun and completely interesting, and I felt very privileged for the amount of time that was put into actually educating me so that I could then go and turn those subjects into stories.
And Mark, Katharine touched on it there, but who's the listener in your head? Who do you visualise when you think about who would listen to a podcast like this?
I think it's really anyone who's interested in finding out a little bit more about not so much how the energy system works, but how the energy system needs to play a very large role in tackling climate change and reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, and the fact that it's not just a future distant or 2050 thing. We're already quite sort of well advanced on that, particularly in the UK with the amount of sort of offshore wind and other sort of zero carbon energies that we're connecting, and that it's a huge area that impacts all our sort of day-to-day lives. As Katharine said, when you sort of turn the kettle on, during what used to be peak TV campaigns, I guess now they're ongoing sort of streaming services and things, but it's how all that happens, instantly and reliably, and the fact that we need to make sure that it's using clean energy sources increasingly in future.
And so we went in with a well-known presenter, Helen Skelton. Can we talk for a moment about the choice of presenter and the process that we went through to choose her? Because that's a very public-facing person, isn't it? That's a presenter who's clearly been brought in to try and reach a wider audience. Why was she a good choice?
Well, I think she was an excellent choice because she obviously had a good public profile, but she was someone who had quite a good ability to question things on behalf of the audience in fairly understandable and day-to-day language. We've got an awful lot of technical capability and experts that can talk about that, and it's really good to have a presenter who's grounded and able to ask questions in a straightforward manner and query those answers a little bit if they need to be either further explained or just made a little bit more accessible.
We often talk as well. You've got the external audience, but we often talk with a large organisation like yours, an element of internal education, internal audience as well, because you've got to encourage colleagues to take part, haven't you, and contribute their own stories and get involved. How did you go about doing that internal education piece to try and make sure that there was buy-in across National Grid internally?
Well, I think that's a really important aspect of it, and a good question. I mean, my colleagues in the internal communications teams, they were already switched on to finding as many and the best ways as possible of engaging colleagues and sharing colleagues' stories around, the work of National Grid. And it is an organisation where most people I've come across have got a genuine passion for what they do and belief in what we do. Internal comms, they didn't have any problems in finding people who were, willing to talk about their role in this. And similarly, in terms of finding people that could contribute to the podcast, there's sort of no shortage of people who are quite willing to give up time and explain a little bit more about what their role is in the picture of what we do and how that fits with the different subjects that we were covering in the podcasts. From a sort of listener point of view, we got quite a high level of almost immediate engagement when we started to put the podcasts out. We had one of our members of staff who did a brief critique of them, and that was published along with the podcast when they went out. And we got a lot of take up and feedback from colleagues across the business, UK and US, gas and electricity, more or less as soon as each podcast episode went out.
One of the main things, I guess, that happened across Series 1 as it progressed is that energy became a hotter topic as it went through, that, it became something that was higher up the news agenda, higher up the political agenda. How did that change your approach? Did it impact the stories you chose to tell? Is it going to change how you look towards Series 2?
Well, I think when we were making the series, the conversation was very much turning to COP26 and fears over climate change. So that probably reinforced rather than changed the agenda. I mean, a lot has happened since then in terms of energy security and costs. So I guess had we been making this series, a few months or even a few weeks later, then we might have adapted it a little bit to reflect, more of what's happening in the industry at the moment. But, the fact is that the moving to cleaner, sustainable energy is almost become more important than ever, even if there's some very sort of big immediate challenges. So I think we would have always made the series in the same way, but probably just address some of the more topical reasons that have since come up.
We did have this kind of discussion at the start, didn't we? When we were about to kick off production, we had about a 4-month period of development where we did discuss approaches, format, presenter in quite a great amount of detail before we actually initiated. And the thing that was useful about that in the end was that we were producing things quite close to current events. So we were able to be a little bit more reactive in terms of reflecting documents that the government, there were 2 big documents the government put out last year that our episodes really bounced off. And if we had gone ahead and produced them ahead of time, we wouldn't have been able to reflect those in terms of transport and the heating and building strategy. So actually it did work quite in our favour to be working quite close to the line on some episodes as we were.
It was around some of those big announcements that, very much sort of impacted or reinforced the clean energy agenda that we already had.
Yeah, and again, just playing into the public perception, they're hearing about these things in the news. It's really much more useful for them to have a podcast that pops up on the topic then, rather than 3 months out or something.
It's funny, isn't it? Because we talk about podcasting as a place where you can do in-depth topics and you can go with a nuance that's difficult to do in news media, for instance, and you can spend more time thinking about things. But still, these issues are so huge. The future of the energy system is such an enormous topic. Katharine, as a storyteller, how do you break that down? Is it about finding people that you speak to that give it a human edge? Is it about breaking the stories down into smaller chunks? How do you go about that?
We started with a rough approach of wanting to look at each topic on 3 tiers. The big top level being the global impact of how such and such issue was relating to climate change and carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, all that. The middle bit being what we do as nations, as countries, as businesses, with technology. And then the closest level being the human story. Although it can be a challenge, that can be the most challenging thing, to find individuals who can speak from personal experiences. There are people who are willing to speak to us who are working in the space. Say, look at heating, for example. We spoke to a heating engineer who's made a YouTube channel just out of all the questions he gets asked, who could talk to us about the questions customers are asking every day when they're making decisions about what to install in their homes, and actually debunk some of the myths and provide information that's really useful to everyday people. So kind of having that human approach to it, that's the way we wanted to tell the story.
And Mark, that must be a challenge you face all the time when what you do is so complex. Does the podcast perform a unique role now in your sort of comms armory at National Grid? Where does it fit into the suite of tools that you have?
I think it fits in really well. I mean, in terms of suite of tools, we've, from an organisation that probably is very, very well known amongst the public, but actually what we do in any level of detail is probably less known. We're looking at a range of things around social, video, events, and podcast fits really, really well into that. So for events, obviously we can talk a little bit more on the ground with specific communities or groups about what we do and how it impacts them, whether that be around construction projects or just more general engagement. For social, it's around trying to engage people with very short, snappy, attention-grabbing headlines that will hopefully draw them into to want to find out more. Whereas podcast is that time to spend 25, 30, 35 minutes or whatever, going into a subject in a little bit more relaxed and engaging way. And I think it allows us to take a serious subject with a bit more time in a little bit more detail, but still being able to explain it in a way that matters either to that, industry expert, to the people that they're working with, or ultimately to the end customer and all the people, all of us that use energy every day.
When we told the story, we took a number of approaches to that as well within the podcast format. So we did have kind of radio style interviews where Helen, as a journalist and a really talented presenter, did interview people directly and ask the questions that people had emotions around and people had questions around and fears around. So that was a very good way of kind of, again, bringing it back to those touch points. But yeah, at the same time, we also wanted to take the story out of the studio. So we tried to feature case studies, whether it was on location in a factory making a rotating stabiliser, have a listen if you want to know what that is, or in a peat bog in Wales, places like that, or in Sheffield city centre where they'd done a regeneration programme that integrated drainage and all this stuff. So like our gradual progression through the series was to present the listener with these concepts and then to build upon them so that really naturally by the time we got to the 10th episode, things were starting to make connections. We're starting to make connections and see how everything integrates, and the energy isn't just this thing that sits irrespective of everything else. It underpins all of daily life, from the way we travel, the way we heat our homes, our businesses, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and I think that's something that we really want to build on in series 2, isn't it, Mark? Because we're starting to revisit some of these concepts in light of what has changed in the public consciousness over the past very busy year in terms of energy, news events, and changing geopolitical circumstances as well.
And so we're moving on to series 2 now, and the format is changing slightly. The focus is changing slightly. Are you able to talk a bit about how this programme is evolving? To
Katharine's point, I mean, series 1 was all about introducing some pretty big subjects and the specific areas where we're active in moving towards clean energy, both sort of UK and US, if not global. Whereas series 2, there's a real opportunity to dive into probably more about how the specifics are impacting certain groups of people, certain communities. Obviously, a lot's happened in a year, and there's a huge agenda now that we already had in mind about what fairness means in energy and affordability, as well as the ambition around making sure that kind of works for everyone in the way that the power system has been constructed already to serve the whole country.
And I suppose the additional question is now, here in the UK, the government's released its energy security strategy. And I suppose the question is now how we can have a secure energy future as nations, and yet make it a green and clean one on the same kind of trajectory that we all agreed with the Paris Agreement.
So there's still plenty to talk about, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot to talk about. Lots change in a year, but the fundamentals are still there. There's a huge demand for clean and renewable energy, and that can help solve a number of issues beyond the important climate change ones.
So Mark, just wrapping up, what have you learnt across this process? I don't think you'd ever made a podcast before. You're about to go into series 2. What have you learnt? What would you pass on to other people who are looking to do something similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges is obviously the logistics of getting the speakers all together at the right time. But in practice, it's worth the little bit of extra effort that might be involved in that, because there's never been an issue with speakers having to be persuaded to take part. There's always been plenty of volunteers internally and externally. It's more just the extra bit of logistics to make sure that they're not all on holiday at the same time, and we've got them all prepped a little bit for what we want to talk to them about without trying to put words into their mouth, and sticking to quite a rigid timescale so that the listeners know when to expect the next episode.
Yeah, regularity and frequencies. Yeah, something we bang on about a lot. Katharine, I know it's a series you're very proud of. What are your thoughts as you go into series 2?
Well, the things I really took away from this experience, sort of personally and professionally, was that at a time of climate grief, climate pessimism, fear, and some pretty heavy world stuff going on, speaking to people at National Grid made me realise there really are solutions out there for the problems that people are facing, and there really are solutions to the questions we have as a world, or at least there are people working on them at the moment. And that's a really lovely thing to take away from the experience, both, as a producer and as a listener, I'm sure, as well. So definitely something we'd like to take forward with series 2 is this journalistic and balanced approach to issues, similar to National Grid being kind of the enabler of all this stuff getting done. They're the good guys who are rolling up their sleeves and making all these pledges happen and bringing together the technologies. I think it would be nice to be the enabler of knowledge. I don't know if you agree, Mark, but the enabler of knowledge and understanding, and perhaps a bit of hope in the public going forwards that solutions are on their way if they're not there already. And it's just bringing a lot of different moving parts together to make it happen.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's really important, because when we were going into COP26 as one of the sort of principal partners or sponsors, we were really keen to concentrate on what is already happening and what big things need to happen to bring clean energy to everyone, knowing that a lot of people have real concerns around climate change, but there is actually an awful lot going on to tackle that already. And that's not to say that these aren't huge issues for society and everyone, but to provide some reassurance that there is a lot happening already. I mean, Britain is regularly powered by over 50% wind already in the last 2 or 3 years, so we're already quite a long way down that route. And I think the other thing to say is, for National Grid, it is really important that we get to a wider audience, so that people who ultimately pay their gas and electricity bills have got a little bit of an idea of what's happening in the infrastructure that supports that.
Well, hopefully we are doing our bit. Thank you very much. That's the Clean Energy Revolution from National Grid. Thank you both. That's Mark Goss, the Group Brand Manager from National Grid, and Katharine Kerr, our Senior Producer here at Fresh Air. And if you'd like to find out how Fresh Air can make a branded podcast for you, you can find us at freshairproduction.co.uk. In the meantime, I'm Neil Cowling. Goodbye. Thank you for listening.
Fresh.